Here we go. We are back in this special session of the Carbon Pricing Conference dedicated to data, analytics, text, and the space angle to drive forces to better understand what could be the carbon footprint, what could be the biodiversity footprint in our industrial activities. First of all, I would like to introduce my distinguished panelists from today, and starting probably with you, Rick, by Trucost by Standard Poor's, and to have a smart presentation for your side to introduce yourself in 30 seconds, 1 minute, and after going around all the panelists and starting the first question, the first issue we're going to address in this hour. Yes, please, Rick, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rick Ward. I'm the Head of Methodology Innovation at Trucost, which is part of S&P Global and our new Sustainable One division. My background is in environmental economics, but I've been working with companies and investors on climate and ESG-related topics for around 10 years now. For those who don't know, Trucost is a specialist data provider. We track around 15,000 global companies in terms of their environmental and carbon performance and provide that data to many investors. They use it in their benchmarking and around reporting. But we also provide some more advanced analytic services around climate risk and environmental risk, including things like transition risk for companies, physical risks, and the transition to the green economy. A lot of my work at the moment is focused around our physical risk offering.
This introduction. I'm going to be back now with Jérôme Tarasca from the Carbon Disclosure Project. Yes, please, Jérôme, the floor is yours.
Hi, Fabrice. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm Jérôme Tarasca. I'm working in the capital markets team of CDP Europe. And I'm working with financial institutions, particularly in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, to accompany them in their journey towards a low carbon economy. I am myself, I have an experience in financial research, but I also launched a startup, a responsible startup a few years ago in Paris. So I appreciate the event focusing as well on startups and tech. CDP is we have started that about 20 years ago, and it's mandated by about 600 financial institutions requiring standardized data that can be compared from a company to another. And then this data is being used by many different actors, including Trucost, and including these 600 financial institutions I mentioned. We do have work, obviously, focusing on climate, and so on the, I would say, carbon pricing, among other things. But we also focusing more and more on biodiversity. So thank you for inviting me on this panel. And just to add, my focus currently is really much on science-based target and trying with investors to drive emission reduction in the real economy.
Thanks, Jérôme, for this brief introduction. Now I'm going to be back to introduce Tommy Rickett from B0 Carbon, the CEO and co-founder of B0 Carbon. Yes, please, Tommy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Great to be here, and thanks for inviting me to speak. So I'm Tommy Ricketts. I'm the CEO and co-founder of B0 Carbon. We're a one-year-old startup based in London that's sort of growing very fast as the economy sort of booms in the climate space. My background is I spent 5 years working in politics and policy, including a stint as a stagiaire in the European Parliament for the European Greens. I then spent 5 years at Bank of America, being originally the UK equity strategist during Brexit, which was a disrupting time as a former stagiaire in the European Parliament. And then followed by working in New York as the global investment strategist. So really sell-side research. And I launched B0 a year ago to really, at a macro level, prove that you can link environmental or ecological prosperity with economic prosperity. They're not a contradiction, they're actually mutually aligned. And the business itself, we're trying to be quite ambitious and build what we're calling CALM, climate asset liability management. So we actually work across the decarbonization space, net zero strategies, carbon neutral strategies, and the sort of data that Rick might pick up on for some of the companies. We also do science-based targeting, etc., and use the CDP analysis. So it's very interesting there. On the asset side, we actually work in natural capital. So this idea of biodiversity moving beyond carbon into ecosystem services, we're very much focused on. And in between, just to be particularly greedy, we've invented a system called the B0 Carbon Ratings Framework, which is a little bit like the S&P rating system, but for the voluntary offset market. So really very ambitious and working very hard in this space. And thanks.
All your remarks that beyond text and data, starting from this point that science-based is not far from our scheme. Let's back now to our also distinguished panelist, Sydney Lobo. Sydney from Mumbai. Yes, please, Sydney, just introduce you, or for people who just not have you on the previous session, introduce you yourself. The floor is yours, Sydney.
Thanks, Fabrice, and hello to all of you guys. Depending on where you are, it's morning, evening, or afternoon. So just a hello. My name is Sydney Lobo, and I'm speaking from Mumbai in India. I've been in the energy business for more than about 25 years. In the corporate world, in the hydrocarbon sector, and then also subsequently in the power utility sector. Have been working in the R&D space, developing technologies and evaluating futuristic technologies. Was part, and I'm still working with one of the AI/ML companies from Canada in looking at certain AI/ML solutions for utilities. Post October 2020, got out of the corporate world, and now I'm working with startups as a senior advisor, mentoring different startups and trying to utilize my years of experience in the clean tech space and helping the young blood to help them commercialize their technologies, because it's the need of the hour that these new technologies need to come on the ground and get commercial at the earliest. So that's quick about my background. Thank you.
Thanks, Sydney. I'm going to introduce the panel by asking for you, yes, Tommy. What is the purpose of the data when it comes to carbon accounting for your side?
Great question. I think first things first, take a step back and say, what is carbon data? Greenhouse gas emissions are generated by creating and moving things predominantly. So actually what you're looking at across the business is those sort of activities, which is why when you do carbon accounting, actually you typically can work with most sectors, because if you think about it in sort of basic physics and engineering terms, it doesn't really matter if you're a cashmere company or you're a financial services company. And then the data is really important for us. We have this idea of radical accountability, that you should be responsible for all scopes of all of your emissions, and we try to calculate them as best possible. But so the integrity of that data is super important, not least because you're trying to diagnose your liability accurately, but also ultimately this is about reducing your emissions, and you need high quality data in order to say, what are the sources of my emissions and where can I be addressing my carbon hotspots? So I say, for that regard, the data for us it's the instrument, if you will, from which you can play the rest of the tune, and without it you can't really do very much.
And just to follow up with this, your remark, Tommy, and address to also the other panelists about the availability of the data. If all it's about accounting, but about also the integrity and the availability of the key data that we have to target before reporting something. What is, Tommy, your point of view of the availability, so the accessibility to those data, and then I'm going to share this same question with our other panelists.
I think, again, a very good question. Patchy would be my answer, and also very country dependent. I mean, in the UK, they publish these things called the greenhouse gas carbon conversion factors. So it's a nationally published sort of data bank, which is really helpful. And there's one in the US, which is about the energy system, which is quite helpful. There is something you can get hold of if you ask the Swiss government. I think there's a little bit of stuff in the French administration you can get hold of, but generally speaking, you then have to rely on international benchmarks. So from a national perspective, it's starting to move that way, but it's not anywhere near as developed as it should be. From a company perspective, I think it's the single biggest challenge when talking about decarbonization is the collection of the data. The calculation of it is not that difficult in my view, especially if you've got statistical engineers working on it. But we call it collect, cut, and communicate. That's our 3 C's of decarbonization. And I was very specifically said collect, because the majority of it is trying to figure out who in the business will have this data and how to get hold of it. So I say there are 2 sides. One, it's very patchy at an institutional level. You can buy SEMA Pro, which is sort of the best thing that we would use. But at a company level, I don't know if you know this old quote, but Kissinger used to say, who do you call when you call Europe? As a sign of saying there is no universal leader there. It's a little bit like this for who do you call when you want to talk about climate. There's no one person typically at a business that can give you all those answers. So that's what I'd say.
Yes, thanks, Tommy. And I'm going to ask the same question to Rick Law from S&P about the availability of the data.
Sure. Yeah, I think I definitely very much agree with Tommy. I think maybe taking the sort of data provider's perspective, I think for many years, the availability of data at the company level on emissions reporting has been pretty patchy. It's definitely improved in recent years with the introduction of TCFD and some more rigorous carbon regulation reporting requirements in some countries. But in many cases, companies might disclose only some of their emissions for some scopes, but not a comprehensive picture. And for many of the investors we work with, what they really need is a complete picture of the carbon emissions profile of all of the companies they invest in, which may be many thousands, but also the many thousands of companies in the benchmarks that they compare themselves against. And so having a complete data set that is universally comparable and complete over time is really a key thing. And so that's really where Trucos was born around 20 years ago, which was to try to solve that problem. And we've grown over the many years to now be collecting data on about 15,000 public companies, so most of the listed companies in the world. We collect that, anything that the companies disclose, whether it be their actual emissions or their fuel use, electricity use, and so on. And then we can normalize that into standardized carbon metrics that everybody's familiar with and bring in data, for example, from the CDP as well. And then where companies don't disclose data, we can make a best estimate of their emissions based on the activities they're involved in. And so that allows us to produce a complete picture of the environmental performance of different companies. And I think as we go along, more and more companies are going to be pressured to release more accurate carbon data. And I think the role of the data provider will shift away from just collating and standardizing some of these carbon data points to the more advanced analyses that maybe connect that carbon emissions profile to more investor relevant financial metrics.
Rick, for this, and going in this field about the availability of the data, I'm going to ask the same question, but in another sense for Jérôme Tarasca from CDP. Do you think that those data should be like an open data set, or what can we deal with this? Quite the same question, just we follow up with Rick with this question and follow up to Jérôme then.
Yeah, thanks, Fabrice. It's a great question. First of all, it's a challenge to collect data in a standardized way, as Rick said, and it takes a lot of work and effort. So CDP has been working on this for 20 years now, and our goal is to have standardized data so that you can compare emissions across all scopes between companies. When we do that, and we work with, last year, for example, nearly 10,000 companies disclosed to CDP. It represents about half of the global market capitalization, reporting carbon data, among other data, to CDP. When we do that, we encourage companies to disclose this data publicly. And as a result of this effort, CDP is an NGO, a non-for-profit organization. And so when we encourage them to disclose this data publicly, and as a result of that, about 50% of companies disclosing data can be found online publicly. Now, you can find data, you can find GHG emissions for a specific company, but if you want to make a professional use of this data and create products based on this or resell this data, then CDP is trying to finance itself by reselling this data. And the reason of that is because the collection of this data is a huge work. We have teams in China, we have teams in India, in Southeast Asia, in America, North America, Latin America, in Europe, in Africa, in order to work with companies, accompany them in their journey to report their emissions. So it takes a lot of effort. So thinking that I would say carbon data or other environmental data is free is also not taking into account that this data de facto has a cost of collection as it is now, due to the fact that it's not uniform and it takes effort and education to help companies provide this information. Now, an interesting perspective of that is that, as we heard, I think TrueCost is doing a tremendous work in increasing the universe of companies with data, even for companies that do not disclose data. I would just like to precise here that out of all the companies working with CDP, there's still a large number of companies that do not disclose data, and for which we have to estimate greenhouse gas emissions. And we work year on year with companies that do not disclose the emission in a standardized manner to try to push them to do that, because it's the first step, in our opinion, for managing their impact. You can only manage what you can measure. So let's start by measuring together. And as you talked about standard way to collect data, what we rely on, we're not a standard setter at CDP, but we use standards that are widely used internationally. And so we work with the GHG protocol that gives clear guidelines and recommendations as to how can a company report their emission in a standardized way internationally.
Well, thanks, Jérôme. We have discussed about the availability of the data, the transparency, not far from this.
Fabrice, you're on mute.
Yes. Hold on. Do you hear me? Is it okay?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yes. Thanks. So we have just discussed about the availability of the data, the transparency of those is not far a far topic. I would like to highlight not only the data set and to collect, and the voluntary also implementation by companies themselves to go in this field to collect and have their own footprint, and the benchmark that you drag also is very important, and a track record one. I would like to go inside the box because the engine to process the data, the tech, the AI is also important. We are in a world of massive information, and I would like to ask this question, yes, with you, Sydney. Do you think that we have also to better understand the analytics and make much more transparency on the analytics, or it could be also tricky because it's like an IP, it's like an asset for companies who have those technologies? What do you think, Sydney, on your point of view?
So thanks, Fabrice. Interesting, and I'll keep this question a little aside, but I will like to bring a point to the first question that you put up to us. And as Tommy mentioned, Rick mentioned that it's patchy, and Rick also mentioned that some countries do have a compulsion that, they should publish their data. I think the root cause of all this is that CO2 emissions or carbon emissions are not statutorily mandated. If you look at any industry across the globe, they would have to file permits for the SPM, for the suspended particulate matter that they emit, for the oxides of sulfur that they emit, for the nitrous oxides that they emit, for the carbon monoxide that they emit. And there is a statutory limit that this is the maximum that you can emit for a specific type of industry for the process. Now, there is a statutory requirement as a result of which the industries file their so-called permits and say that this is my limit, this is what I have done. And it's available with the so-called pollution control boards or pollution control departments. But nowhere is anybody saying that you have to disclose your CO2 emissions, be it scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3. It's not mandated anywhere. It's always voluntary. And I think that's the challenge everybody faces when it's voluntary, to get it out of the system or to get it out of these industries. As I think Tommy mentioned, right? There's no one person that you can go to and tell that, okay, what's your overall CO2 emission in the industry? They may not tell you. But if it is mandatory that you have to disclose it, then that makes a difference that they will have to disclose their CO2 emissions. Now, whether they are authentic, whether they are accurate is a secondary question. But at least those numbers mandatorily will be out on the website or in the open forum. So that is something which is required. I'm not saying that there has to be a threshold, that this is the limit that you can, emit. Otherwise, even for you and me as human beings, we'll have to set a limit because we are exhaling CO2. Okay. So I'm not saying put a limit, but make it mandatory that you have to disclose your CO2 emissions, and it has to be statutory. So that's when the data will come out. Now coming to the analytics part. Data is the so-called, it's a big ocean. Analytics is utilized to analyze that data for a specific goal. I mean, you may utilize the entire data to, do analytics of the trends. You may utilize the data package to look at, do certain predictive analysis. So the entire AI engine will do some predictive analysis, and it can only analyze the data. So it's always a lag indicator. It's the data is factual. It's what is coming out of your actions and whatever you do. Based on that data, one would utilize algorithms to do various analysis based on a certain end result that one is trying to look at. So that's where the analytics part comes into play. Thank you.
And I would like now to come with Tommy with this question. Do you think that the regulation now has to go on another level so as to cope with what said Sydney? Or do you think it's too early? But as the net zero target is very impressive to match and the time is running, do you think that the regulation and a very impactful regulation could be helpful for everyone indeed?
So, yeah, a great question. So the UK has introduced this year for the very first time the streamlined energy and carbon reporting framework, which makes it mandatory for companies with either two of these three. I think it's $36 million in revenue, 18 million pounds in book or on their balance sheet, and 250 or more employees. So there's a little booming mini economy right now in SECR, as it's called, responses. And my understanding from friends in Westminster is that that's going to increase. And so roughly speaking, that's about 10,000 companies out of 6 million in the UK, but obviously the largest. And if that increases to the next bucket down, that would be probably 40,000. So I think you're starting to see that trend emerge. And it's kind of very correlated to the severity of the net zero target. How legal is that? Is it a target? Just like some companies are setting targets, or is it a mandated piece of legislation? And I think France is very strong. Obviously lots of other European countries on this. So there is evidence of it happening, and that's typically a way of countries showing that they're making corporate activity kind of count. but it's obviously just the start of a process. And I think the other side to this is what forces companies to change if regulations are not doing it. Well, it's what do the capital markets think? And actually from, I think it's 35% of MSCI ACWI companies are now doing this on their own. And the biggest driver of that is investor demand or ultimately consumer demand. So I think companies ultimately will have to be ahead of regulations, although I think regulations will start to come in big kind of steps as opposed to a gradual increase, because it's been demanded of them by investors in a way which never had happened before, in the rise of ESG and the data that the colleagues here are helping create. So, in short, regulations is part of the answer. I think markets will already do a lot of its job for them. But certainly I'm not aware of any other countries where it's law for their large companies to report. But even then, as you were saying, it's only scope 1 and scope 2. So it's not like they're going far enough as far as we're concerned. So the more regulations, the better. But ultimately, it's about creating, as Sydney said, the idea that it's mandatory to report.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a good introduction to the other point I would like to address. Thanks, Tommy. To Rick. Do you think, Rick, that companies have to anticipate the regulation from now and design internally a strategy to set up an internal carbon price, so as to anticipate, in fact, the probably something which is not by a voluntary approach, but by a constraint. So they have to adapt and to be on the game player in 1 decade or ahead. They have to anticipate this thing and to put a price directly in other product, in other accountancy. Do you think, Rick, that companies have to do it from now, not to wait the regulation is coming to push them in this direction?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And maybe just briefly to comment on the previous question as well around the importance of regulation. I think absolutely I agree. Regulation is really important to push companies towards disclosing more and being more transparent. We've seen that a lot amongst our clients in France, where there's been huge requirements put on investor clients, but also companies to begin disclosing more. But I think on the other side, there's a lot of private sector initiatives that are really pushing companies as well. So one that comes to mind is the Glasgow Alliance Financial Service Alliance for Net Zero, which is signed up to by around 30 or so of the largest financial institutions. And so that's them essentially committing to understanding their emissions and reducing them towards net zero over time. And that's particularly interesting because obviously for financial actors, what they really need to be working on is their investments and then the companies that they finance in terms of their lending activities. So it puts a lot of pressure on those companies to try to reduce their emissions over time. On the question of carbon pricing, I think it's a really interesting topic, and we work both with individual companies, but also with investors on the topic. With companies, we generally see there's a recognition that carbon pricing is going to become more stringent over time. They can see governments moving in that direction, even if it hasn't happened yet in the particular sector and country where they operate. And so companies are often very interested in trying to understand how high could carbon prices go in the future from a regulatory perspective. And if they do go that high, what would be the impact on my financial position for the company? So how does that impact my expenses, my margins, and overall my earnings in the long run? So we work with companies often on that question. And as part of that, we'll often help them to think about, if we were to set an internal carbon price, what level should we set that price at? And then how do we implement that to try to change the way the company makes decisions and allocate capital to the kinds of projects and activities that would reduce their emissions over time? Similarly, I think when we work with investors, they're obviously looking a little bit from a higher level, I guess. They're looking across many companies, but they want to understand the same kinds of things. So how would my portfolio be impacted from an earnings perspective through carbon pricing? And then how can I engage with those investee companies to try to help them to improve their performance over time?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Rick. Just to also to make the connection and with Jérôme. Do you think, Jérôme, there is now a new championship that now the target is not only to make some pledges to say we will be as an organization, public and private, to be net zero. It's not only the purpose for the private sector to make the connection with RIC, the purpose of RIC is now there is a new championship. It's not only about your value on the stock exchange, it's also about the value of your work to be net zero. And saying this, the championship and the rules are not the same. So as we are in a voluntary process today, so the regulation to be net zero is not here from now, do you think that now it's an open door, an open championship when and where the fast mover will be the next leader, and the slower, even if you are big today, you will be not part of the piece on the world of net zero tomorrow? Do you think, how do you propose another angle to your point of view on this? Is there?
Yeah, I mean, your question is interesting. I think the value of company is already being changed by the exposure to emissions, and companies have understood that because more and more companies disclose their emissions, not only because they are mandatory requirements, like in Europe through the ETS scheme and the soon to come the CSRD regulation, so a regulation that will ask all companies in Europe, independent of their size, to report their emission. So this is currently a proposal with the European Commission. So all companies have already understood that. And why have they understood that? Because there's different stakeholders asking them to care about this, including investors, as Rick said, including their clients. They also see their peers moving. There's regulators pushing. So it's a consortium of action. And reporting emission is just a first step, but it's just a picture of where your company is at in terms of exposure. But what do you do next? So next is, well, you try to take measures to reduce this exposure so that your value, the value of your company in the future, won't be impacted. So investors care about that because they could, their investment could be impacted. So there at CDP, we identify a few, I would say, best practices or good action to try to reduce these exposures for the companies themselves. And it's setting an internal carbon price is one of them, because we published actually last month a report on carbon pricing. It's available on the conference website. I invite everyone to have a look at it, because it details that, first of all, the number of companies using an internal carbon pricing has kept raising in the past 5 years, almost double in 5 years. So it's really something that is growing. We can see that about half of the largest companies in the world have an internal carbon pricing. And why do they do that? Well, when they disclose this information to CDP, and about 6,000 companies disclosed this information to CDP, they say that it helps them dedicate effort to low carbon investments. So having a carbon pricing helps them focusing on low carbon investment. It helps them, secondly, drive energy efficiency measures. And second, it changes internal behavior. So that everyone can actually capture this information in a monetary way. And what is interesting in this report that is based on empirical data reported by companies is that we can find that there is a strong correlation between companies having an internal carbon pricing and companies having ambitious emission reduction targets. Ambition reduction targets, sometimes even validated by independent bodies like the Science Based Target Initiative. So it's correlated, and it's correlated with claims and I would say transition plan to be net zero by a time frame consistent with the Paris Agreement, so net zero by 2050 or before. So these measures and these actions are correlated. They are part of best measures that can be put in place by high emitters, but not only, by the whole economy. And yeah, it's interesting to see that there is a movement in place, and And we need this, I would say, external independent assessment to ensure that these are not just false claims, that they are actually in line with what science tells us. And I think once there will be, and there is already, we can see more than 1,400 companies working with the Science-Based Target Initiative and setting ambitious reduction targets, but it still has to be more. The whole economy has to set science-based target and align themselves to the Paris Agreement. So that's the reason why, for example, at CDP, we launched an engagement campaign for investors to take part of, and which is currently in its second year, where investors are asking large emitters to set 1.5 degree science-based targets. And this is, to my knowledge, the largest campaign of the sort, because 1,800 companies that are targeted, and it's been backed by nearly 140 financial institutions and representing nearly $20 trillion of assets. So there is a clear direction, a clear drive from investors, but not only, for different stakeholders, to take action, to ask companies to take action and take ambitious reduction targets, put an internal price on carbon, disclose their emission, and get these emissions validated independently, audited, so that we have a good base to work with.
Thanks, Jérôme. And to have a real overview of this field, we are going also to share with you, all of us and you, our panelists, a message from Laurence Monnet-Smith. She is the head of sustainability of CNES in France, CNES, which is the National Space Agency, and she's going to drive us an overview on the climate from space and what can the space provide us to monitor all this data and to produce new data, newcomers enterprise, new startups who are going to catch up the link between clean tech, climate tech, and also space tech. So we're going to share with you his exclusive interview. We are back with Laurence Monnet-Smith from the CNES. The CNES is a French special agency. Laurence she's an advisor on the presidency dedicated to climate issue, and we are very, very pleased to welcome you on this specific panel according to the data, the tech, the analytics, and what can the space could provide and help us monitor the environment, monitor the climate, but not also. So yes, Laurence, we are very pleased to welcome you and let you introduce your purpose.
Hello, very, very nice and very pleased to be with you. Actually, I'm also head of sustainable development and performance at CNES, not only advisor to the president. So I'm very I'm very happy to be with you and to share some ideas and some facts about how actually space and special agencies, the work of special agencies around the world is helping to fight against climate change.
What do you think the space could have already provide to help us to monitor the environment, and how can space could help us better take care of the impact of our industrial activities on this environment, which is the most powerful carbon sink, the natural carbon sink?
Well, we've been working for a while with the international community and academics around the world and engineers within space agencies around the world. The international program, which is called Global Climate Observing System, has been created in 1982, roughly, and has been working with within the frame of the UNFCCC to help to define some criteria, what we call essential climate variables, to define them and with this definition to modelize the climate and to monitor its evolutions. When you think about it, so 1982, this was the beginning of climate observation through new instruments installed on satellites. And with this group, the observing system, we have defined over 50 essential climate variables. Of course, they had to answer to some very specific criteria, like technically available, economically accessible for the main countries, and very important to characterize the evolution of the climate. And when you have all these criteria together, on this over 50 criteria, more than 26 can only be observed from space, which means that the role of space agencies, the role of engineers and scientists working with us is really extremely important to characterize the evolution. So this has been since 1982, roughly, and now since that time, since the middle of the 1960s, we've had more than 50 satellites that have been used throughout the time, and addressing this global observing system, which has been the base for all the research, the main research that has been done within the UNFCCC and the IPCC frame.
Yes, well, you mentioned, and you greatly highlight that you're not also a climate advisor, but the head of sustainability. And when it comes to apply it in our organizations, public or private, what could the space help enterprises or public organization to better manage, to have the quality of the data, to better manage their impact on environment, specifically probably the private sector?
Well, space has done a lot, especially at the European level, because we've developed at the European level the Copernicus system. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard about that. And the Copernicus system is the follow-up of the first program that has been launched in collaboration between France and the US with the TOPEX Poseidon program, which was measuring at the sea level. So we were very famous, and we have been working a lot on altimetry, what we call altimetry. And Copernicus is a European program that has been developed for now more than 20 years, and the satellites are offering images and data on open source to everyone, every countries in the world. So that's the gift, the European gift to the world, because those data measure actually sea level, measure lots of variables, what some of them I've mentioned before. And they can be used by not only any companies, but any government which is developing its own policy in environment, whatever the topic. So we are measuring deforestation. We're measuring some biodiversity indicators like habitat, the way, and even some we're measuring also some species, how they evolve, where they are, how they reproduce, what we can see. So many variables. Those data are open to everyone through portals, and there are different services that are provided to companies and to any public entity. For example, there are climate service, which is called C3S, climate change service, which is a huge portal where everybody can find data and use case about climate change on their own, and even on their own region, because those data are available everywhere in the world from every continent. I mean, you can find information and data to any cities in the world. So you can measure climate change, you can measure biodiversity, you can also measure, you also have an alert system for major disaster, but I can talk about that a bit later if you want. And you have data about meteorology as well. So all those data are open and free and accessible to everyone. I'm not saying that they're easy to use. One might need an expertise, or their companies can help you to define the product you might need, but they exist, and we pretty much are the only area in the world providing such information globally, recurrently to everyone.
So it's a good point, Laurence, to highlight that we see that space is a provider, is the infrastructure of the data providing, a massive data providing. When it comes to those data, it's all about the data of everywhere on the climate or environment impact. So it comes on public goods or common goods. How can we, you mentioned the framework of the open data in your purpose. So from your perspective, do you think that today, with the new space, they would have other models, not only public or open data, but also some key data who could be very important to have, but they wouldn't be public, they probably be private. So when it comes to the climate, to the environment, how can we deal and align with those issues on the model development and the investment before and the common good, as we highlight now with the new also administration in US, the common good. How can we deal with this?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Europe has implemented an open infrastructure, making sure that we can all have access. Maybe there are minor exceptions linked to defense and securities, but basically all these data linked with climate change or biodiversity are accessible to everyone. Nevertheless, you're right. The development of microsatellites or constellations that are launched by private companies might jeopardize this issue. I'm not as I would say that I'm not afraid or scared by the fact that scientific data will be private. I think the international scientific community linked with Earth observation, the group on Earth observation, for example, who's the major alliance at the international level of academics linked with research on climate change issues, are extremely active in making sure that those data are accessible to everyone, provided to everyone. And to be honest with you, I don't think a private company will be interested in monitoring climate and making those data private. And you know why? It's because it's extremely expensive and nobody is really paying for it. So it is a public good paid by states or groups of states or by bilateral cooperation. What I'm more interested in, or what I'm more, cautious about, are not necessarily those data, but more specific data that can be, because where the added value of those scientific data is in the specific treatment that you can do on it, and crossing those special data, space data, with other type of data, and that's where you're creating value. And this is obviously a business, And because you need, if you want to sell this information, well, it can be very interesting, for example, for a city or for a company to exactly have an idea of what's going to happen in the next 10 years. For example, if you want to build a city and you want exactly know how if you're on the coastline, what's the climate's going to be and how the sea level is going to rise. And you want to know what will be the impact of this sea rise on the infrastructure you're building. Well, this space can tell you, but it's not enough. You need to work on a model. I'm talking about that because that's one of the projects of the Space Climate Observatory. And this work on the data needs a lot of modelization, artificial intelligence, algorithm, you name it. And this work on data, not only you need to have the open data, but you also need a specific treatment on this data, and this is going to be sold. Well, how are we going to be sure that, how are we going to make happen that all the most vulnerable countries will have access to this? Because one cannot, one state or public research cannot, and it's not their job, to work on this more specific platform or information that you can have from the data. And you need a business model to do that in order to improve it. So that's what we're doing in the Space Climate Observatory, financing projects like that and making sure that private companies, for example, will be able to maintain those modelization and to share it with vulnerable countries. So that's kind of, hybrid model we're trying to invent, because working on data needs knowledge, needs expertise, and not everyone can do it. So you need kind of public-private model to provide that to some countries. Some countries can pay for it, some areas cannot pay for it. So we're trying to organize this public-private mix that not some are paying for it, but we also share. So that's what I'm more, cautious about, because I think that sovereign data, like the one that can modelize climate, will not in a short period of time will be privatized. I don't think so. You have to think about the price of the instruments that are installed on the satellite. They cost an absolute fortune, and I don't see a private company doing it.
So it's a good conclusion, Laurence, that you have highlighted, and in fact you have co-designed with us in this talk what is sustainability, what could be ahead of sustainability, or not only for the CNES perspective, but a global perspective. It's all about sustainable public and private partnership. It wouldn't be only public, it wouldn't be pure private. It's about co-building from public and private sustainability we want. And data is in the core reactor, the core engine with the analytics to make it happen. So let's go ahead with the scientifics, the tech people, and also the public policies to support this framework, also for countries who have not the capability or the infrastructure to make it, because we live in one world. So I'm very pleased, and we are very pleased to welcome you, Laurence Moignier-Smith, from the CNES, the French Space National Agency, and very pleased to go ahead in this field very soon on the Carbon Pricing Conference. So thanks a lot, Laurence, and keep tuned.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks. We are back in now with the overview of the space industry. What can we put in place from climate, from carbon data, now also with the biodiversity? I would like now to address with Tommy. Do you see a direct connection from space and your job? according to the biodiversity footprint to monitor. What can we deal with this, not only on the carbon accounting, but on the biodiversity accounting?
Sure. So absolutely, there's a very important role to play, and interesting to hear Laurent's comments about. I think roughly half of the types of climate emissions can be observed spatially or via space. I thought that's really interesting. On biodiversity, look, there are two ways to think about assessing ecosystem services, if you will, biodiversity, pollination, water systems, climate change, etc. One is from the ground up, so physically testing sequestration on the ground and measuring, monitoring it, either for companies or literally through the nature-based solutions. The other one is from satellite imagery or GIS assessments. So you can start to model and project environmental change and returns, and what's happening, whether that's biodiversity, whether that's canopy coverage, whether that's levels of sequestration. But I do think that they're mutually beneficial, and you shouldn't, spatial or space-based technology in order to understand climatic or environmental changes is only one tool. It's a very important tool, and I think will be a very significant tool moving forward. But part of the issue with using it indiscriminately, if you will, or as the only tool, is that you need to do a lot of modeling and effectively make a lot of assumptions. So you do need to keep making sure that you have that bottom-up data as well. So literally bottom-up and top-down in this instance is a very good place to start. But a huge role to play, and I think that's a very growth area in the kind of startup community. You just need to go on a job website, and if you look at what the jobs are on offer are, you'll see a lot of GIS analysts. So that we've got 4 that work for us.
Thanks, Tommy. And for how can we say a macroscopic level, and the question is for you, Rick. Do you think now it's a time of convergence from carbon accounting and natural capital asset, that it means biodiversity accounting? Rick Lord from S&P.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting question, and I think biodiversity is becoming more and more of a focus for a lot of investors that we work with. So not only trying to understand where their investments might well be contributing to biodiversity by understanding where those companies are operating, but also potentially even thinking about how they can support biodiversity through the kinds of net zero commitments that many financial institutions are making. And I think that makes given that many of the activities that might be supporting a net zero commitment might be around reforestation or the regeneration of natural ecosystems, that brings together the idea of reducing carbon, but at the same time trying to support livelihoods and ecosystems that derive from those specific environments in the future.
Ahead in this field, and I will ask also to Sydney, do you think now there is a time of convergence, not only according to the agenda, because the COP26 is in November, the COP15 on the biodiversity cumming is also in November. Do you think, Sydney, that there is a time of convergence, not only on the COP side, but on the topic side, that carbon issue, climate issue, and biodiversity issue, when it comes with the natural carbon sink, which is the Earth itself, it's a real time now to be net zero and to embed all these pieces in the same table, not in different table, but in the same table. What do you think on this perspective, Sydney?
Very valid point, Travis. And I think it has to be looked at it that way, because see, carbon abatement is not just one solution, or not one technology can address carbon abatement. You have to look at different technologies in order to do your carbon abatement. You have to look at different sequestration opportunities, and developing a carbon sink is one of the areas which has to be looked as a natural technology package. I mean, nobody can, of course, you can do genetic engineering into plant species and things like that, but typically a plant will grow the way it has to grow. And these carbon sinks, they don't develop overnight. So it takes time. So it may take, depending upon the species that we're talking about, it may be, say, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. That's where the carbon sink plays a big role, because whatever standard scientific engineering technology cannot do in terms of carbon abatement or in terms of circularity of carbon, that's what the sink will do, And we have the ground as a sink. I mean, I think recently now UK has started some experiments on farmlands to try and identify as to how farmlands could become major carbon sinks. We know that, forest and biodiversity areas are big sinks. So it is one of those technology packages, but it's a natural process. So that has to be looked at together and not as standalone. The other aspect of the fauna, in terms of the birds and animals and all that, that is a different aspect, because it encompasses into biodiversity. When we're developing a green sink, the biodiversity then grows because of these fauna coming into that space and creating a different atmosphere. I'm not saying that they are responsible or not responsible for the carbon abatement, but they do play a significant role in the entire management of the biodiversity or the natural carbon sink. So yes, it's all a package deal, and one has to look at it that way. Thank you.
To give you the open floor now, and back to Rick in 1 minute. What could be your conclusion? What you would like to share to the audience? Please, Rick.
I think maybe just as a final thought, I think the data available to try and inform decision making for many players, whether they be investors or companies, around climate, biodiversity, and many other topics, is perhaps much better now than it has ever been before, and is becoming much more available. So I think with that comes ambitious commitments from those players in the market, but also a lot of expectation for them to begin to generate a positive impact on some of these topic areas. And so I think it's a very exciting space to be working in, and I think we'll see a lot of progress made in the next 5 years or so.
Your input, Tommy, to push the limits of the program.
Sorry, the conclusion.
That's it.
Sure. So I think data is king. I like that line Jerome said about you can't manage unless you can measure. I think that's very, very true. I think what's happening at the moment is, if you think about this collect, cut, and then communicate sort of pathway, the world is exploding in the diagnosis of these problems, and the services, CPD and True Cost are quite long in the tooth, 15, 20-year organizations. But what's really changed in the past 2-3 years is that idea about what do you do with it now, and how do we actually address, these underlying things through a confluence of factors. So, there's a lot of innovation and new technology coming to light. I think there's a lot more human capital coming to apply their skills to this area, and I think it's all pushing in the right direction. But certainly, the more we can do to promote that agenda, and I think I just wanted to say one thing on internal carbon pricing. I think that's a really, really important development, and we encourage it with all of our clients, because the missing bridge, and I'll leave you with this thought, between the environment and the economy is that pricing signal, and that's the really, really crucial thing here. So that's my 2 pennies.
Okay, thanks, Tommy. And now back to Jérôme. Jérôme Tarasca.
Yeah, thanks, Fabrice. My final thoughts are, I'll echo what Tommy said. So we need carbon pricing disclosed by companies, and we need regulation to make this a mandatory practice all around the world, so that the externalities related to carbon are priced by the companies themselves, and it triggers change. I like the way that you ended this session looking at biodiversity. That would be my second final thought is, I think the climate change is certainly a big topic that was in the agenda for years, but we can really see everywhere in the investment community, in the public eye, that biodiversity is a growing topic. And it's critical that it becomes a growing topic. There's a tremendous loss of biodiversity being done. Around 31,000 species, nearly 1/3 of all assessed species on the planet are threatened with extinction. So we need urgent action. I encourage companies also to start looking at their dependency and their impact on biodiversity. On CDP side, we've had for nearly 6 years now not only looked at climate and carbon footprinting and climate-related indicators, but also looked at water consumption, water pollution, and deforestation. And we want to expand this work around natural capital, as we 2 weeks ago launched a partnership with BNP Paribas Asset Management for the development of metrics so that companies can report in a standardized manner to investors and to the public. So yeah, let's keep working in this direction. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thanks all my distinguished panelists, and thanks to Jérôme Tarasca from the CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project. Thanks to Sidney Lobo, former Chief Business Officer by Tata Group, Tata Power. Thanks Tommy Rickett from the CEO co-founder of B0 Carbon, and thanks also to you, Rick Lord from Trucost S&P's Global. Thanks all, and hope that the audience have enjoyed what there is behind the data, beyond the climate, carbon, and now biodiversity emerging trends data. Thanks a lot also to Laurence Moyer-Smith by remote from CNES, the National Space Agency, and just keep tuned for the next session.